Hello, I'm Lugatorix and welcome to my Holy Roman Empire faction guide for Medieval 2 Total War. Today we're going to be discussing the faction of the Holy Roman Empire, their units and just some general campaign strategy for the Grand Campaign. Now as you can see over here on the long campaign rules, you have to hold 45 regions including Rome to complete the Grand Campaign, and the strengths of the Holy Roman Empire are, well, they're strong all round, which is pretty good. I mean, if you like a sort of strong, solid unit roster, then this is kind of the faction for you. Weaknesses: lacks the late period professional armies of England and France. So basically what that's saying is better at the beginning, start to fall off at the end, which is commonplace for actually quite a few factions, and this is maybe an example of one of them. Still, I always think it's quite a strong faction. Very interesting, the Holy Roman Empire. Don't kid yourselves, the Roman part of it is really just, yeah, as it says here actually, particularly misleading name. It's got nothing to do with Rome, okay? If you want to play as Rome, then the Byzantines are the closest you're going to get. Still, this is an awesome faction, which is in a kind of unique predicament because they are right in the centre of the map. There are factions every side of them, and it's very easy to get dogpiled very quickly, and it's very easy to get excommunicated. In fact, it's almost impossible not to get excommunicated. So if you're worried about that, again, this is probably not the faction for you. Holy Roman Empire is, of course, Catholic, in case you're wondering about that. Anyway, let's just have a look at the unit roster first. So this is the Holy Roman Empire's unit roster, and we're going to start off, as per usual, with Peasants. Yeah, 4 attack, 3 defense, poor morale. Only use them for cannon fodder, damn it. Don't rely on them. I don't think anyone relies on Peasants, but unless you're doing some sort of challenge. But just so you know, Peasants, they're not that great. Anyway, we'll go on to Town Militia next. And again, I've mentioned Town Militia many times before. Only a small step up from Peasants. They do have some decent spears, but they're still pretty bad. 5 attack, 7 defense. They're okay at garrisoning a city, well, like a town or whatever, castle, but I mean, then don't rely on them. But they're okay in the early game, basically. Then we get on to Pike Militia. Now, Pike Militia are interesting because 7 attack, 1 defense. Now, they can form a spear wall, which makes them slightly better defensively because obviously it's harder to penetrate a wall of spears. So they're quite orderly like that, and they have very long spears, so it's hard to actually reach them. But if they are reached, then they just collapse instantly. I mean, for example, a cavalry charge into the side of this, and with 1 defense, the unit is going to just collapse instantly. So in certain situations, they might be decent, but honestly, they're not a huge step up from Town Militia at all. And Town Militia actually have 7 times better defense, so you might want to consider that. Next up, Spear Militia. Now, Spear Militia, 5 attack, 7 defense. Pretty similar to Town Militia, but these guys can form a Skiltrum, which is a similar defensive formation, which is kind of like a phalanx, but it's not quite, and it's basically just a wall of spears. Now, if you can form a Skiltrum, it does kind of boost your defense a bit, certainly from cavalry charges in the front. That's why it has a bonus fighting cavalry, but again, these guys are nothing particularly special. They'll do a solid job in the early game against cavalry. Next up, Sergeant Spearmen, trained and hardened warriors, protected by a large shield, armed with spears and able to form a defensive ring of spears. So they can form a Skiltrum. They have a 7 attack, which is solid for early game Spearmen. It's 9 defense, which is a step up. They can form a Skiltrum. They haven't got any morale debuffs or anything like that. Pretty solid unit we've got. And again, you can see they're just slightly better armoured. They've got a nice big shield. You can see that it's bigger than all these. I mean, what are these bastards doing? Okay, nice big shield, which is really, really cool. So they're more hardy troops. They are warriors, like the game says. And they'll do a decent job in the early game, definitely. You can see their stats are better. Then we get on to Armoured Sergeants. Now, this is really where you see the upgrade. Okay, this is the first unit where you think, okay, this is significantly better. Now, Armoured Sergeants are basically much better armed, or armoured rather, versions of these guys, because they have a defense of 14, which is pretty much evidence of that. They're armed with spears, they have large shield and mail, so the mail armour is really what gives them that 14 defense, and for an early game troop, although it will take you a while to get to these guys, very, very hardy troop. Can form a Skiltrum, which of course helps as well. Bonus fighting cavalry, but these guys are quite hard to get down. They will chunk through troops, and particularly in the early game, that if you have these guys, they will have a lot of advantage over rubbish spearmen of other factions. So pretty solid unit, and their hardy defense means they're going to break much less frequently. Or less frequently. Grammar, you know what I'm saying. Then we have Halberd Militia. This is, I believe the Danes have this as well. Militia units armed with a halberd, I think I'm saying that right, which can fend off cavalry and pierce or crush armour. Now, only 5 attack and only 1 defence. They don't look amazing on the face of it, but they can form a spear wall. They are effective against armour, and, you know, I mean, they only have an attack of 5. You've got to consider this. But it is nice to have an effective against armoured troop, and particularly in the early game, if you have an armoured troop, then they're pretty much invincible because there's not a lot of armoured piercing stuff in the early game. So any troop that has armour piercing is good to a certain extent, but their low defense, I don't really rate them. I mean, they're very long spears, it's nice, but they're just vulnerable to missiles, like it says, because they'll just crumble under anything. So not a huge fan. Obviously, armoured sergeants is better, but situationally, they can be alright. Then we get on to Dismounted Imperial Knights. Now we're talking. These mace-wielding fighting machines wear plate armour but prefer to fight on foot. 9 attack, 17 defense. So the defense is higher than even the armoured sergeants, which is awesome. They've got a 9 attack, which is pretty solid. But it's their armour. The fact they're well armoured means that really, unless you've got armour-piercing troops, these guys are going to stand up to a lot. Okay? They've got good stamina, they're less likely to break, and again, these guys will just chunk through stuff. Okay, badass knights, well armoured with a mace. You don't want to fight against them. They're a pretty solid unit, definitely. Then we get on to the swordsmen, so dismounted feudal knights. These are obviously knights that would normally be on cavalry or on horseback, but for some reason they are dismounted. And actually, they're pretty effective dismounted. So, 13 attack, I believe that's the highest we've seen so far, which is really good. They are excellent heavy infantry, like the game says. 21 defense. Now you've got to remember, these are not spearmen. Okay, these are knights. So you know, spearmen. I mean, they're a defensive unit. You kind of expect them to have high defense. It's kind of a prerequisite. But feudal knights, 21 defense is very, very high. If you get these guys as quick as you can, they are going to do an absolutely brilliant job. They're well armoured, so you're going to have armour-piercing troops against them. They can chunk through a lot, and they can take a lot of hits, so certainly recommend these guys. They're great. And then we have an interesting unit, Forlorn Hope. These desperate men are armed with a massive two-handed sword and thick armour. 17 attack, 12 defense with a charge bonus of 6, which is kind of underrated. Combat bonus in woods or snow, good morale, well armoured. Pretty solid unit. Now, this is something I'd say every single time, but you do need to look at how many men are in a unit. Now, this unit has only 30 men. Now, obviously, it depends on what unit scale you play on, but this is half the amount of men than in, let's say, a dismounted feudal knight or armoured sergeants. And I do generally find units that have not very many men in them to be less effective, because they just can get easily surrounded and they can be easily overwhelmed. But definitely these guys fight hard, so situationally they can be good, but they're not going to hold a front line or anything because there's only 30 of them. Okay, so I always reference them to Arcani because I know Rome Total War better. In Rome Total War, you think the Arcani are going to be really good because their stats are amazing, but actually you look at them and they're only like 30 men in a unit and they're not that effective on the battlefield. But they can be effective sometimes if you use them situationally. I just wouldn't rely on these guys, but they have some good stats. 17 attack is amazing. Okay, it's 4 better than the dismounted feudal knights, so do take that into consideration. And two-handed swords, it's like something from Skyrim. Okay, it's awesome. Now we have the Zweihander. Right, I mean Zwei is 2 in German. I actually studied German and I was terrible at it. I had to study it, but anyway, that's another story. Zwei is 2, right? Yeah. Right, Zweihander. These well-trained warriors are protected by plate armour, and there we go, and wield a mighty two-handed sword. I'm guessing Zweihander means 2 hands. You know, who would have guessed that I passed German? Oh, I don't know. Right, 14 attack, 11 defense, charge bonus of 6. Pretty solid unit, good morale. I'd say any unit with good morale is a good unit in my book, because they just won't break, and morale is so important in Medieval 2 Total War. You know, you don't want to get units breaking at any time. It's annoying when a unit breaks, and a unit with good morale you can generally rely on to fight to the bitter end, and that's what I like about these guys. Now, they do like their two-handed weapons. Their Zweihander weapons. Impressive look. Oh, I haven't mentioned their name. Dismounted Gothic Knights, okay? We're getting into the Gothic period now, these guys. I mean, you can just look at them. You can see they're well armoured. You don't even need the description, okay? These are badass people. Impressive looking knights. Yeah, you're not saying. Well protected by armour and armed with a two-handed sword. 14 attack and defence. Charge bonus of 6. And again, good morale, which I just mentioned, is pretty good. So, this is the infantry, or the sort of heavy infantry. Good stuff, okay? You've got good stuff in the early game. You've got good stuff in the later game. The Spearmen are pretty solid, but I particularly like the Swordsmen, particularly the two-handed Swordsmen. It's a nice touch the Holy Roman Empire have. So, big fan of their infantry, basically. Let's have a look at their missile troops. We start off with Peasant Archers. I've mentioned Peasant Archers many times before in my faction guides, my other faction guides. Will do an okay job if they're on like a high ledge or something like that. Obviously, do not rely on them in the melee, but they're archers, so if you have to rely on Peasant Archers in the melee, you've probably lost the battle. I hate to break it to you, because they only have a knife. Missile attack of 5 is okay, but pretty underwhelming, okay? It's not too bad. I'm pretty sure this is like the only archers they have, because they go straight over to crossbowmen. Yeah, so they're okay in the early game, but that's it. Crossbowmen are better. Peasant crossbowmen. So the melee, in terms of melee, still trash in the melee, but that's irrelevant, pretty much. Missile attack of 9 is nearly double the amount of the Peasant Archers, so pretty solid. The crossbows are obviously better than the normal bow and arrow, and they're pretty solid. I mean, they're vulnerable to missiles themselves, but obviously that's their defense is low, so that's kind of a prerequisite of that. But a solid unit, missile attack of 9 is pretty decent in the early game, so yeah, I like them. Crossbow Militia, very similar unit, to be honest. Very similar unit. I mean, the stats are pretty much the same, so there's not a huge amount more to add to that. But again, the Crossbow Militia, yeah, pretty decent. Now we have, I struggle to say this every time, Arquebusiers. I think I said it right last time. I think I hopefully said it right this time. Anyway, I mention them every time, so here we go. Missile attack of 14, which is an improvement, but obviously these guys are carrying a handgun or a, some sort of like gunpowder weapon. So obviously they're going to have a better missile attack, because guess what? A gunpowder weapon has more attack than the crappy bow and arrow. So obviously they are better in the melee with an attack of 6 and defense of 9. But considering these are sort of like mid to late period troops, really this is not going to stand up to anything in the melee, because comparatively everyone else has improved so much. So again, these guys are not melee troops in any fashion, but that's pretty obvious looking at them. The main thing that's good about these guys is the morale debuff that it gives to the opposition because of the noise and smoke, but it is also lethal from like close range. It's not a long range missile by any stretch of the imagination, which I kind of find I'd prefer longer range missiles personally, but still the morale debuff, hugely vital, okay? This kind of stuff, anything that lowers morale can just change the tide of a battle so quickly, so I'm a fan of them in that regard. Then we have the Impervious Crossbowmen. Again, I mentioned these guys a lot. Missile attack of 12 is pretty good. Long range missiles, again, I just said that long range missiles I prefer, because you can start getting hits on the enemy really, really soon, so that's awesome. Now, defense of 14, that's pretty solid, okay? Defense of 14 for a missile troop is excellent, in fact. Now, although it's not vital, it is nice to have that sort of security that if for some reason there's a gap in your front line or whatever, and a unit does charge into the Impervious Crossbowmen, at least they can stand up a little bit, although again, they're not going to do an amazing job. But the long range missiles is certainly good. If you want to have a long range missile troops, I recommend these. Then we have hand gunners. Earliest handheld firearm unit. Causes more fear than actual damage. These soldiers need to be capable in close combat due to the short range of their weapons. So, like it says, melee attack and defense are pretty decent. In fact, it's a lot better than these guys. Missile attack of 13 is pretty solid. Not quite as good as these guys, but then basically the same. It kind of plays down the actual lethality of them, but honestly, pretty decent. But again, it really is the fear, the morale debuff to the enemy that is the good thing about these guys. So again, not a huge amount more to add, but any morale debuff is good in my eyes. Next up, Mounted Sergeants, so Cavalry. These veteran warriors wear light armour and are armed with a spear and sword. 9 attack, 13 defence. These are light cavalry, and light cavalry is naturally fast than heavy cavalry, but for this light cavalry to have a 13 defence, pretty good. I rate that. I rate that a lot. So veterans, and they know what they're doing. I like them. Then we have Merchant Cavalry Militia. Looking pretty fancy, I might add. Poorly trained, but well equipped cavalry who fight with a sword. 6 attack is a little bit underwhelming. 14 defense. For cavalry is pretty solid. I mean, the cavalry is sort of notorious for having poor defense. But the fact that these are well armoured means that they do a good job. And you don't want to I hate this when you charge into a unit and then you realise that actually you did more damage to your cavalry than them. This is less likely so because they're well armoured, and the fact that they are poorly trained and might just charge or do whatever the hell they want, which units have a tendency to do in Total War anyway. Good job they have a good high defense, right? Then we have Mailed Knights. Now these guys are more professional, obviously. They are armed with lances and swords. They have the same defense but a higher attack, so they're going to do more damage basically, which is pretty good to see. And good morale again. Good morale for cavalry is really quite important because if you do get stuck in a sort of long protracted melee, quite often the cavalry will just collapse after a while, particularly obviously if they're against spearmen. But if they have good morale, they can just do that just about enough damage and to stay alive for long enough to win the battle. Cavalry really does turn the tide of a battle, so good morale, like to see. Then we have Feudal Knights. May charge out orders, it's the first thing I see here. I'm not a big fan of that, but at least they have a 16 defense and good morale. So if they do charge out orders, then you can live with it for a little bit because they actually have good defense. They can form a wedge, well armoured, good stamina, a solid unit, just a little bit disorderly, but I like them still. They do a solid job. Then we have Imperial Knights, these mace-wielding fighting machines wear plate armour and are equipped with lances for a deadly charge. 10 attack, 16 defense, a charge bonus of 8, good morale, powerful charge like I just said, and well armoured. Really quite solid cavalry we're looking at here, and particularly with the charge bonus, any unit with a good charge bonus means that it's just that one vital charge in the battle with the heavy cavalry that can just cause a mass rout if you charge particularly into the back or the side of the enemy infantry. So to have a unit that has such good charge bonus is excellent to see because that's what it does. Then we get on to the General's Bodyguard. Obviously the General's Bodyguard is good because they're protecting the General. They should be good. 13 attack, 16 defense. This is the early period one, so you know it gets better later on. Basically later on they have better armor. That's pretty much the only difference I can see. They just have better armor. This horse has a nice bit of metal around its face and that keeps it safe. Then we have Teutonic Knights. Ruthless Germanic knightly order, well armoured with lances and large maces. These knights love a good melee. Who doesn't love a good melee? 13 attack on cavalry is pretty good. In fact, it's very good. 16 defense, very good as well. Solid charge bonus. I mean, this is just strong, heavy cavalry that can inflict not only a lot of damage, but a lot of morale penalties. And then finally, we get on to Gothic Knights. Look at that armour. Isn't that beautiful? Impressive looking, yeah, they are impressive looking. Heavy cavalry, well protected by armour for both rider and mount, equipped with a lance and mace. 13 attack, 15 defense, charge bonus of 8, good morale, good stamina, well armoured. I don't need to say any more about these guys, they're pretty badass. Then we have the mounted crossbowmen, so we're on to the missile cavalry now. 7 attack, 10 defense is pretty decent for missile cavalry, I'll grant them that. It's pretty solid, it's nothing amazing, it's not as good as these guys, but they're not missile cavalry, so they're less diverse. But a missile attack of 5 is a little bit underwhelming. It's exactly the same as the peasant archers, and considering these guys are crossbowmen, I would personally like that missile attack to be a bit higher, personally. Then we get on to, how do you say this, writers? I don't know. Anyway, who cares how they're pronounced when they are that good, okay? First of all, pretty damn solid in the melee. 11 and 13 is comparable to this early period cavalry, okay? That's pretty similar to these guys. So, they're a missile unit, but actually, they're all right in the melee. They're all right in the melee. But it's the missiles that's good about these guys. Let's not worry about that. Okay? They've got a pistol, and they're on a horse, okay? Literally, these guys are like cowboys. They're badass. Do cowboys have pistols? It doesn't matter. Of course they do. They have gunfights. Right. 20 missile attack. On a horse, nothing more needs to be said. Okay, a 20 missile attack is amazing anyway. Couple that with the maneuverability of a horse, the agility of a horse, the speed of a horse, and you've got an amazing troop. So definitely recommend these guys, but you won't be able to get them straight away, unfortunately. Now, if you want to have a look at the siege equipment and all this kind of stuff like cannons and all that, I mentioned it in my England faction guide. I don't want to repeat myself because it's pretty much the same for all the factions. So if you want to hear about that kind of stuff, go to my England faction guide. That's where I talked about this stuff. But we have 2 more units, so we'll have a look at them as well. These are sort of like the Crusader units. So religious fanatics, first of all. 13 attack, 1 defense. These guys are notorious for basically being hardly fight. Well, they fight hard, but they're not exactly well prepared. They are literally in like a robe because they're sort of like zealots from religious places. So they will attack hard because they want to kill people in the name of God, because that's how God works apparently. But really, in the defense, they're pretty terrible. So a mixed unit, but they have good morale, so it kind of depends. Again, situationally, they're good, but they're really quite unorganised. I'm not a huge fan. And then we have Landsknecht Pikemen. Okay, I did actually study German for a little bit. Believe it or not, I actually gave it up, and this is the reason. I did not study at A level. Anyway, originally from the Holy Roman Empire, these elite mercenaries are armed with pikes and their distinctive slash and puffy clothing. 11 attack, 4 defense with a 4 charge bonus. They've got a lot of things going on though. Okay, they've got a bonus against cavalry and in woods of snow. They can form a spear wall, good morale, very long spears. So this is kind of a mixed unit. I'm not a huge fan, to be honest. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not a huge fan. But again, any unit with good morale is a solid unit indeed. So we've looked at all the units now. These are the Holy Roman Empire units. So I think it is time to move on to some campaign strategy and talk about that. Okay, so here we are. Now, as you can see, the Holy Roman Empire starts off with quite a big empire. Okay, they call themselves an empire, and they're not joking because it is an empire. It stretches from Bologna, I think that's how you say it, Bologna, down here in what is now modern day Italy, all the way up to Frankfurt up here. And we actually get given an army which is technically not in our territory, and we'll talk about this army in a second. It's obvious what you need to do with it, but just in case, we'll talk about it in a second. So you start off with quite a few settlements: Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Innsbruck, Staufen, Bologna, and Vienna. Okay, so not a small empire by any stretch of the imagination, but of course the difficult thing is the factions around you. And talking of the factions around you, I'm actually going to turn off the fog of war right now. Just a quick disclaimer, I don't play with the fog of war off. I mean, that's proof because I can't even bloody type it in. I don't play with it off, I only show you the fog of war off on the faction guides because it just makes it easy to show you what's around, because you can't physically see it otherwise. So now you can see who and what is around. So the factions that are around you are Denmark, which is important, up to the north. We have the French that border you over here. We have the Polish that border you over here. The Hungarians over here. The lads from Venice, the Venetians, that's the word, Venetians. The Milanese, the lads from Milan over here. And then, I mean, sort of the Papal States, if you want to count them as well. And a lot of rebel territory. Now, a thing I will say quickly about the Holy Roman Empire is it's very, very tempting to overextend quickly, okay? There's a lot of rebel territory around. It's very tempting. Just think, rebel territory, easy, quick grab, okay? We can grab it, that's great. And that's cool, that lasts well for a while. But if you overextend, then first of all, you're going to border more and more factions. You're going to encroach on their space more and more. And you're going to get trouble quickly. Particularly because if you, let's say, pour your troops up here to take these rebel settlements, maybe France will attack you down here. Or the Milanese, and you'll be stuck, and Innsbruck will be gone quickly. Something like that, okay? So just be careful not to overextend too quickly, because that can cause trouble. Another thing is, choose your alliances carefully, okay? You do not want to be going to war with Denmark, France, Poland and Hungary at the same time. Also, you do not want to expand in more than one particular direction at a time, really. You do not want to be at war with Poland and France at the same time, because you're just going to get surrounded. Okay, you really need to focus your troops. So what you want really is to have various alliances. Now, where would I want to have an alliance with? I'd probably have an alliance with Hungary, personally, and probably with France, if you could try and get an alliance with France. France is a powerful ally, okay, if you want them. And hopefully that means they can focus mostly on the English and keep out of your way. Definitely France I would try and get an alliance with. personally, and I'd probably try and get Hungary as well. You definitely want at least one alliance, because otherwise people will just dogpile you. Okay, if you've played Rome Total War and you know the Seleucids, who are basically in the middle of the Middle East, and they just get dogpiled by every faction, well, a similar thing will happen if you are not careful as the Holy Roman Empire. Now, where would you first expand? Well, as I said at the beginning, the Holy Roman Empire is vulnerable to excommunication, because basically the only ways you can expand are either into rebel territory or into Catholic territory. Apart from maybe the Byzantines down here, and even to get to them you'd have to pass through Catholic territory, there really isn't much in terms of non-Catholic territory, okay? So you're not going to be going straight for the Byzantines, spoilers. So really you're going to have to get excommunicated at some point, unless you wait for factions to attack you and then you attack them back. I mean, it's difficult. Personally, I'm never too bothered about excommunication, but you do have to be wary that the Pope can call a crusade against you, and then if you do need to be careful, okay? If a crusade gets called against you, goodbye to your campaign. Say goodbye to your campaign, because everyone is near to you, everyone will want a piece of the action, and things could go wrong very, very quickly. So it is a kind of balance of, if you want to play the long game, don't attack too many Catholic factions at the beginning, and just take the rebel settlements and wait for them to attack you. But if you're like me and don't play in a rush necessarily, but you want to expand, because this is total war, damn it, okay? You're meant to be fighting. So in which case, you're going to have to accept excommunication at some point, and you're going to have to accept the consequences that come with that. But anyway, what would I do first? Well, there's an army, and it's near Hamburg. Okay, Hamburg is a castle, and it's not got a huge garrison. So really, going for Hamburg is pretty much an obvious. Okay, they want you to go for Hamburg. Okay, you got what, 6 units here, should be enough to take Hamburg. Now, if I had to focus on one faction immediately, it would be Denmark, and there's a couple of reasons why it would be Denmark. One, they're going to attack you anyway, okay? They could expand into Scandinavia, but really they're going to expand south. So they're going to be an enemy. Even if you form an alliance with them, they will break that alliance because they haven't got much choice, okay? So Denmark is going to be an enemy of you regardless. You might as well get the first blow. That's kind of my opinion. And also, Denmark only starts with one settlement, Aarhus. So if you attack them early, you can just destroy them quickly because they don't have any other settlements and all is good, right? Now, if you, for example, attack France straight away, they're stronger, and also it will take so long to destroy them, and by that time Denmark get quite strong because they've taken rebel settlements while you've been focusing against France, and then you've got another big faction on your hands. You might as well just eliminate a faction before they get too busy. That's my opinion. So first of all, take Hamburg. Now you do need to be careful because, you know, there's still a decent amount of Danish force. They're very concentrated here. So if you do attack Aarhus, yeah, up here, you know, they got a wooden wall, you know, they'll do a solid job. They could do a bit of damage to you. So you do need to be careful. So I would take Hamburg and then get some troops up, maybe from Frankfurt or something like that, and reinforce Hamburg and then move forward against the Danish when you're confident that you can take Aarhus and deal with the remaining armies. But if you can do that, then you've destroyed a faction. Beautiful, well done for you. Now, as to where to expand next, that's tough, and it depends on where you've put your alliances. For example, if you've allied with France, don't attack France because that's just stupid. I mean, it's easier if you go maybe for like Poland, I would say, or Hungary, because that's easier territory to take. But it's kind of up to your discretion. I'm going to leave that to your discretion, really. And it also kind of depends on if a faction attacks you. Now, if a faction attacks you, then you can kind of go ham on that faction for a bit, because you can take land without getting excommunicated. Because the Pope's like, well, they did attack you, you can attack back. So let's say if you were fighting Denmark and then the Milanese attacked you, then probably going for Milan would be an obvious choice because you're less likely to get excommunicated, and as I discussed earlier, you don't want to get excommunicated. So I'm going to leave that up to your discretion where you would attack after Denmark, but my opinion is don't expand too quickly, go for Denmark when you're ready, go for whoever attacks you, probably not France. Anyway, that's it. It's only a short guide, but I mean, you might disagree with me, you know, it's all good. So anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you around.